Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The night sky stretched endlessly over the plains, a canvas of deep purples and blues, dotted with stars that twinkled like far-off promises. Cale had been walking for days now, his worn boots crunching against the gravelly path as he pressed onward, past the last village on the edge of the wild lands. His sword, strapped across his back, clinked softly with every step, a constant reminder of its presence. He paused for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow. The air was cool, but his journey had been long, and exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. Above him, the sky shimmered, and for a brief instant, everything around him fell into a strange, eerie silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, and then, in a flash of brilliant white, it came. A meteor, blazing across the heavens, trailing fire as it plummeted toward the earth, disappearing behind the distant Serpent Spine Mountains with a rumbling crash. The villagers' whispers echoed in his mind, "The falling star, it holds a power that could reshape the world. A power greater than any man should possess." Cale's heart raced. He hadn't believed the stories at first. He wasn't one for chasing myths. But there was something about that meteor, something that stirred an old, forgotten feeling deep within him. A part of him that longed for redemption. For absolution. With renewed resolve, Cale adjusted the strap of his pack and set his course for the Serpent's Spine. Whatever lay within those mountains, it wasn't just power, it was a chance to right the wrongs of his past. It wasn't long before Cale found himself traveling with companions, though none of them were exactly by choice. The first was Lyra, a rogue as sharp-tongued as she was nimble. They had met at a small tavern just 2 days into his journey, where she had overheard his plans to head toward the mountains. She had offered her services, though Cale suspected her interest in the meteor's rumored power had little to do with generosity. Then came Darius, a stoic mage whose deep knowledge of the arcane was matched only by the shadows that seemed to cling to his presence. Cale could tell immediately that Darius wasn't a man to be trusted, but he had no choice. The journey ahead would be perilous, and Darius' magic would prove useful in a pinch. Finally, Garrick, a former soldier turned mercenary, his face hard with years of battle and betrayal. His eyes told the story of a man who had lost much and was willing to do whatever it took to gain it all back. Cale hadn't asked, but it was clear that Garrick, like the rest of them, had his own reasons for seeking the meteor. Together, they made an uneasy alliance. The trust between them was fragile, like thin ice over a deep, dark lake. Any wrong move, and it would all shatter. As they trekked through the rugged wilderness, Cale remained on edge. He didn't fully trust any of them, and they didn't trust him either. But the looming presence of the Serpent Spine, with its jagged peaks and ominous cliffs, demanded their cooperation. For now, anyway, they camped one night near the base of the mountains, where the cold air bit at their skin and the fire crackled softly between them. Cale sat slightly apart from the others, sharpening his blade, while Darius poked at the fire with a stick. Lyra leaned back against a rock, her arms crossed, watching Cale with a smirk. "You don't talk much, swordsman." Cale didn't look up. "Don't have much to say." "Or maybe you're just keeping secrets," she said, her tone teasing but with a sharp edge beneath it. Cale finally glanced her way, his gaze steady. "We all have secrets." The rogue laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Ain't that the truth?" Garrick, who had been sitting silently with his back to them, turned his head slightly. "We should be focusing on what's ahead, not on each other's pasts. Those mountains are cursed, and we'll need every bit of strength we have to get through." Darius spoke up then, his voice quiet but firm. "The legends are clear. The meteor is guarded by forces beyond anything we've faced before. We must tread carefully." Cale nodded, his grip tightening on his sword's hilt. He didn't need Darius to tell him that. He could feel it in the air, the sense of something ancient and powerful waiting for them. And it wasn't going to let them take what they wanted without a fight. The journey up the serpent's spine was a grueling one. The terrain was treacherous, with narrow ledges and crumbling rock paths that threatened to send them plummeting into the abyss below. Worse still, the air grew thinner the higher they climbed, making each step feel like a battle in itself. And then there were the guardians. The first came at them just as they reached the edge of a vast plateau. A hulking stone golem, its body covered in glowing runes, emerged from the rock face, its eyes burning with an eerie light. It moved slowly but with terrifying power, its massive fists capable of crushing boulders with ease. Cale drew his sword without hesitation, rushing forward to meet the creature head-on. The others followed suit, Lyra darting in and out of the golem's reach with her daggers, while Darius cast spells that crackled with blue lightning. Garrick, true to his soldier's training, moved with precision, striking at the creature's joints in an attempt to slow it down, but the golem was relentless, its strength overwhelming. Cale's sword clanged uselessly against its stone body, and for a moment, it seemed as though they were doomed. It was Darius who finally found the solution. He muttered a string of ancient words, and the runes on the golem's body began to flicker. With a final burst of magic, the mage shattered the creature's core, sending it crumbling to the ground in a cloud of dust. Panting, Cale sheathed his sword, glancing over at Darius. The mage stood tall, his face calm, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled Cale. He had seen power before, raw, untamed power, and Darius had it. But power like that came at a price. As they continued their journey, Cale couldn't shake the feeling that Darius was hiding something. Something dangerous. The traps came next. Ancient mechanisms, set long ago to protect whatever lay at the heart of the mountain. The first was a collapsing bridge over a deep, yawning chasm. They had no choice but to cross it, and as they did, the wooden planks beneath their feet began to crack and splinter. Lyra, always quick on her feet, was the first to sense the danger. She made it across with ease, but the rest of them were not so lucky. Halfway across, the bridge gave way, and Cale barely managed to grab hold of the edge before plummeting into the darkness below. Lyra was there in an instant, pulling him to safety. "You owe me one," she said with a wink, though there was a flicker of genuine concern in her eyes. Cale grunted, brushing off the dust from his clothes. "Don't worry. I always pay my debts." But the traps weren't done with them yet. As they ventured deeper into the mountain, they encountered more, a hallway lined with pressure plates that triggered deadly spikes, a room filled with noxious gas that had to be neutralized by one of Darius' spells, and a pit of fire that required Garrick's strength to lower them safely to the other side. Each obstacle chipped away at their patience and trust. Cale could feel the tension building, like a coiled spring ready to snap, and then it did. They reached the heart of the mountain just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the ancient ruins that surrounded the meteor's resting place. It lay in a shallow crater, glowing faintly with a soft, pulsating light. But as they approached, they realized they weren't alone. A rival group of treasure hunters, led by a warlord named Voran, had beaten them there. Voran was a brute of a man, towering over the others with muscles that bulged beneath his armor. His men were well armed and clearly ready for a fight. Cale's hand instinctively went to his sword, but before he could draw it, Lyra stepped forward. "Voran," she called out, her voice smooth as silk. "It's been a while." Voran sneered. "Lyra, I should have known you'd be here, sniffing around for scraps." Lyra smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing to you. The tension between them crackled in the air, and Kale could see the truth now. Lyra and Voren had a history. A bad one. Without warning, Voren's men attacked. Steel clashed against steel, and the battle erupted in chaos. Kale fought with everything he had, his sword flashing in the dim light as he parried and struck. But even as he fought, he could sense something was wrong. Lyra was gone. He caught sight of her slipping away toward the meteor, her eyes gleaming with ambition. And that's when it hit him, she had planned this all along. The betrayal stung, but Kale couldn't dwell on it. Not now. He turned his attention back to the fight, but it was clear they were losing. Voren's men were too many, and Garrick was already injured, blood pouring from a deep gash in his side. It was Darius who turned the tide. The mage, his face twisted in concentration, unleashed a torrent of dark energy that sent Voren and his men scattering. But the cost was clear. Darius was no ordinary mage. The power he wielded was ancient and forbidden, and Kale knew they were walking a dangerous path. With Voren's men defeated, Kale turned to confront Lyra. She stood at the edge of the crater, her hand reaching toward the meteor, her face lit with an almost crazed expression. "Don't do it," Kale said, his voice steady but filled with warning. Lyra turned to him, her eyes wild. "You don't understand, Kale. This power, it's everything. It's the answer to everything." Kale shook his head. "No. It's a curse." For a moment, it seemed like she might listen. But then, with a swift movement, she reached out and touched the meteor. There was a flash of light, and Lyra screamed, her body convulsing as the power of the meteor surged through her. Kale rushed forward, but it was too late. Lyra collapsed to the ground, her body still and lifeless. Kale knelt beside her, his heart heavy. She had been reckless, yes, but she hadn't deserved this. None of them had. And then there was Darius. The mage stood over the meteor, his eyes fixed on it with a hunger that Kale recognized all too well. It was the same hunger that had driven him years ago, the same hunger that had led to his greatest failure. Kale stood, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "This ends now." Darius looked at him, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "You can't stop me, Kale. This power, it's beyond anything you've ever known." Kale drew his sword, the weight of it familiar and comforting in his hand. "I've known enough power to understand its price." The battle between them was swift and brutal. Darius, fueled by the meteor's magic, fought with a strength Kale had never seen before. But Kale had something Darius didn't: clarity. With a final, desperate strike, Kale disarmed the mage, sending his staff clattering to the ground. Darius fell to his knees, defeated. Kale stood over him, his chest heaving with exertion. "It's over." Darius looked up at him, his eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and admiration. "You're stronger than I thought." Kale shook his head. "It's not about strength. It's about knowing when to stop." With that, Kale raised his sword and brought it down, shattering the meteor into 1,000 pieces. The power that had drawn them all to this place was gone, scattered to the winds. The mountain began to shake, the ancient ruins crumbling as the meteor's destruction triggered a chain reaction. Kale barely had time to drag Darius to his feet before the ground beneath them gave way. They ran, the mountain collapsing around them, barely making it out alive. When they finally reached safety, Kale turned to look back at the serpent's spine. The mountain was gone, buried beneath tons of rock and rubble. And with it, the meteor's power. Lyra was gone. Garrick, too. The price had been high, but Kale knew it had been the right choice. As he stood there, watching the dust settle, Darius approached him, his face pale and gaunt. What now? Cale didn't answer right away. He didn't know what the future held for him. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. The weight of his past had been lifted, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew he could face it. Without a word, Cale turned and began walking. Away from the mountains. Away from the past. Toward whatever lay ahead, and this time, he was ready.